As series founder Hironobu Sakaguchi was accepting a promotion to Executive Vice President, a new era was beginning for the Final Fantasy franchise. We now enter the Katase era, an era which spans 3 games in the series, and which will go on to become the most popular and commercially successful era of the entire series. As I mentioned in the last retrospective, Final Fantasy V was, in my opinion, the best Final Fantasy so far, so new director Yoshinori Kitase has some big shoes to fill with today's game. Does he continue Sakaguchi's legacy, or does he end up literally pissing all over the Final Fantasy franchise? There's only one way to find out. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Final Fantasy VI Retrospective. Although Sakaguchi wasn't actively involved in the creation of this game, due to his new responsibilities as Executive Vice President at Square, he does receive billing in the credits as a producer. The general version of events is that Sakaguchi provided some mild oversight to ensure that the 2 teams on the game would actually work together to create a cohesive whole. While I consider this to be the start of the Kitase era, Yoshinori Kitase was only one of 2 directors for the game. The other director was Hiroyuki Ito, who directed the gameplay for the game while Kitase directed the story. I am choosing to call this the Kitase era rather than the Ito era because, in the RPG genre, a game's story is the most important part of the game. It's the equivalent of the jumping mechanics in a platformer or the guns in a first-person shooter. So whenever there are multiple people in charge of a game, whoever gets the most amount of final say in the game's story, that's the guy who I consider to be the true director of the game. Now, some of you might reasonably ask, why do I make such a big deal about who the true director is? Why can't I just accept that it was developed by Square and get on with discussing the actual game? Well, the short answer is, because I want to give credit where credit is due. As Jim Sterling once pointed out in his video, Credit Where Credit's Due, a lot of people tend to place credit for the game's creation purely on the studio. For example, we know that The Witcher 3 was developed by CD Projekt Red, but very few people could name the game's directors or writers off the top of their head. There are a handful of game developers who have name value like Shigeru Miyamoto and Hideo Kojima, but they're few and far between. To rectify this, starting with my Splinter Cell Blacklist retrospective, I have started mentioning the game's director by name whenever I do a retrospective or review of the game. Honestly, I feel it's the least I can do to rectify this injustice. The problem of game developers staying anonymous probably won't go away overnight or even in my lifetime, but I at least feel obliged to do my small part in giving the game's development talent some long overdue recognition. Of course, I can't possibly name drop literally every person who made even the slightest contribution to the game, both because I can't possibly trace everyone's individual contributions. Seriously, special thanks? Thanks for doing what exactly? And also because trying to associate dozens, if not hundreds, of people's names to a particular product would become overwhelming really fast. So, as a sort of middle ground, I have decided to focus on the game's director. Even if a plot device or gameplay mechanic might have been someone else's idea initially, the director is the one with final say in the matter. So it is the director who I will repeatedly give credit to for the game's successes and blame to for the game's failures. And if I'm going to do that, I need to first determine who the game director even is. And for this game, I have determined that the true director is Yoshinori Kitase. So, with that out of the way, let's begin the retrospective proper by discussing. Right out the gate, one thing I noticed about this game's graphics is just how muted the color palette is. The colors are much darker than they were in previous Final Fantasy games. Compared to earlier games, look how bright and cheerful the overworld is. With Final Fantasy VI, it honestly seems like Kitase was going out of his way to bum the player out playing this game. The color palette honestly would feel more in place for the second half of the game, where everything has gone to shit. But this is what the overworld looks like in the first half of the game. This game also utilizes the Super NES's Mode 7 feature, which allows a pseudo 3D over-the-shoulder perspective when you're riding around on chocobos or flying the airship. There was a similar system in place with the airship in Final Fantasy IV, where the overworld map was placed on its side to create the illusion of a 3D world. It worked in Final Fantasy IV, but it doesn't work here. All because of one simple reason. I can't tell which cardinal direction I'm facing. For the first time in the series, the world map is visible on screen at all times, rather than me having to pause the game to see it. When I'm in the airship or on a chocobo, there's an arrow on the map pointing in the direction I'm facing, which is supposed to help me tell which direction I'm facing. However, the fact that this map is supposed to be on screen at all times means it can only take up part of the screen. Now, combine that with the fact that my character's arrow likewise takes up only a small portion of this already teensy map, and the fact that this entire game was itself designed for a 256 by 240 resolution TV screen, and you can start to see how this HUD can quickly become an eye-squinting, headache-inducing pain in the neck. Hell, when I played this game for footage, I expanded it to 4 times its original size, and I still had trouble telling what direction my character was facing using this tiny-ass HUD. So I can only imagine what kids back in 1994 were going through. Then there's the music. I mentioned a moment ago that the overworld seems designed to bum the player out with its muted colors. Well, the music only further confirms my theory. I've said it before when reviewing previous Final Fantasy games, and I'll say it again here. Nobuo Uematsu is a shit composer, and this game is perhaps his shittiest composition since the original Final Fantasy I on the NES. Not only the overworld music, but the majority of music in this game overall just seems intentionally designed to invoke a sense of hopelessness and despair. That might work for the second half of the game, but it doesn't work for the first half. There are a few songs in the game that evoke a sense of excitement and happiness. But the moments in the game where these songs actually play are few and far between. The depressing and sad score is especially irksome when we're talking about the characters' themes. Take, for example, this moment when Celeste believes that she's been left all alone as the sole survivor of the world. Out of depression, she decides to throw herself off a cliff. This moment is accompanied by some rather sad music. Okay, so it's sad music accompanying a sad moment. What's the problem? Well, the problem is, this music isn't the suicide music. This is the Celeste theme. A character's music should be emotionally neutral. Character music is supposed to play whenever that particular character is taking center stage. And since the moments when the characters are taking center stage can have nearly any emotion, the music that plays in those instances should likewise be able to back up and amplify nearly any emotion. An exception can apply to characters who only tend to invoke one or two emotions whenever they're on screen. One example of such a character is the main villain, whose presence typically invokes senses of foreboding and danger. However, in regards to Kefka, the main villain of this game, Uematsu managed to fuck even that up. Does this music sound even remotely foreboding or evil? At best, you could call it mischievous. This honestly sounds like the music for a comic relief side villain like Ultros, not the main villain who we're supposed to take seriously. Meanwhile, Bowser, an actual comic relief main villain, has some of the most consistently badass themes in video game history. Just goes to show you how just about any musician that Nintendo hires is a better composer than fucking Uematsu. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. In the last retrospective, I praised X-Death's theme for being a perfect main villain theme, and that song was also composed by Uematsu. So how can I call him a shit composer when he's proven to be capable in the past? Well, the simple answer is, if he were a good composer, he would be hitting it out of the park consistently. Anybody can have the occasional gem of inspiration, but guys like Jeremy Soule, Yoko Shimo, this chick who composed the Super Mario RPG score, and Yuka this guy who did this game, can all produce consistently beautiful and memorable soundtracks for games. Uematsu, at best, is hit or miss. The problem with Uematsu, however, is that when he misses, he doesn't just hit the ball. He loses his grip on the bat, causing it to fly into the stands and hit a fan in the head, causing his baseball team to get sued. Sometimes his songs are decent, sometimes they are quite good. But when they suck, they really, really suck. Uematsu, stop it. Stop making shitty music. You suck at music. You are a shit composer. Stop being a shit composer. So overall, the aesthetic presentation for this game is a huge downgrade from Final Fantasy V. Hopefully the game can bounce back when we discuss... There will not be a separate section in this video dedicated exclusively to discussing how the battles in this game work, because quite frankly there's nothing new to say. It's literally the exact same system that has existed in the last game. You want my thoughts on the battle system? Go watch the previous Final Fantasy retrospectives. There's my thoughts right there. That being said, there are a couple of gameplay improvements to this game that are new to the series, most of which I actually like. There's a subplot where a character named Celise has to pretend to be an opera singer, since she looks so much like the opera singer she's posing as, and has to actually perform in an opera. Surprisingly, despite the fact that Celise is a war general, not an opera singer, she apparently has a decent set of pipes, and also has the uncanny ability to make her voice sound like Maria's voice, as well as looking like her. I wonder if this game is using the fact that it doesn't have voice acting as a crutch in this regard. There's also a section of this game where 3 different groups are off doing different things in different locations simultaneously. We actually take control of each group one after the other. I really like that idea. The only problem is it only happens once in the entire game. That said, there are several instances in this game where you take control of multiple groups, but they are in the same location, so you can switch between them on a dime simply by pressing the Y button. This mechanic is indeed used multiple times, both to fend off enemies coming from multiple directions, and also to solve switch puzzles in dungeons. Yes! For the first time in this series, we actually get some decent puzzles in the dungeons. Final Fantasy V teased some puzzle-like mechanics, but never really dove feet first into the idea of having dungeons that were focused around puzzle solving. But in 6, we actually get some fairly interesting puzzles that take quite a bit of thinking to figure out. We divide into 2 or 3 groups and have to figure out in what order to step on the switches to clear the path to the rest of the dungeon. Oh my god, yes! This is what I've been asking for since the first game. This is great, this is fun, and it's only for 2 dungeons in the whole game. Yeah, only the penultimate dungeon, Phoenix Cave, and the final dungeon, Kefka's Tower, actually have these multiple group-based switch puzzles in them. It's honestly quite disappointing, like being served only a single morsel of a nice juicy steak. This game continues the series' unfortunate trademark game mechanic of not adequately telling the player where to go to advance the story. Once in a while, I'll get the occasional clue. For example, I'm told that I need an airship in order to enter the Empire's home turf. I'm told that Celise looks an awful lot like the opera singer Maria, and I'm told that Setzer, the owner of the world's only known airship, has the hots for Maria and plans to kidnap her and force her to be his bride. In that case, I put 2 and 2 together and realize that I'm supposed to have Celise pose as Maria in the opera so we can hijack Setzer's airship. That's pretty easy to figure out. However, half the time the game just seems to drop me into the world with nary a clue what to do next. Sometimes it even seems to go out of its way to actively mislead the player. Take for example this segment. I just took Cid's raft and used it to get off the island and head to the mainland. I have no control where I end up, and I am deposited next to this city. Now, in all my years of playing games, anytime the game deposits me next to a city without me getting a say in the matter, that usually means I'm supposed to enter that city. But nope, that city doesn't have anything interesting for the player at this point in time. Instead, what I'm supposed to do is go north, past Kefka's Tower, and enter the town of Tizen. Why? Why not just drop me off next to Tizen instead? Is it because you want me to pass by Kefka's Tower? Well, there's going to be a cutscene where the Light of Judgment is activated once I enter Tizen, so I'm going to learn about Kefka's Tower any damn way. But perhaps the most egregious instance of the game not telling you how to progress the story has to come with knowing how to recruit Realm in the second half of the game. According to an online guide, I was supposed to enter Owzer's house and check the bottom left painting, but when I did, nothing happened. Most online guides I checked didn't account for this error. It took me asking for help from one of my existing subscribers and finding an old message board thread, not even a guide, just somebody else experiencing this exact problem, in order to figure out what to do. Brace yourselves, because this is so cryptic and so off the wall that it will make your head spin. As I was fleeing the floating continent, I had the opportunity to either jump off onto the airship or wait. I wasn't told what I was waiting for, so I didn't realize there was any benefit to waiting. However, because I didn't wait, that means Shadow perished in the explosion and therefore is no longer available as a player character. This means that Interceptor, Shadow's attack dog, is instead watching over Realm's unconscious body inside the Cave of Veld. I'm supposed to visit Realm's body in the cave and drag her body to her hometown of Tamasa to recover. I do that, but the game still doesn't update Owzer's house. Turns out I'm supposed to leave Tamasa, re-enter Tamasa, visit her in her bed again, ask about her progress in making a recovery, then leave Tamasa again, re-enter Tamasa, enter her bedroom again, and check to see if she's still in the bed. If she's still in the bed, I'm supposed to talk to her again. I need to continue this cycle of talking to her, getting an update on her progress, leaving Tamasa, and re-entering Tamasa until I notice her bed is empty. Then and only then will Owzer's house update to allow me to continue the story. Jesus Christ, Katase, do you think just a wee little bit of direction would ruin this game? At least with the original Legend of Zelda on NES, exploration was the whole point of the game. Of course, as much as I crap on this game for its lack of player direction, what really kills this game and makes it fall flat on its ass is the most important part of an RPG. The story. That leads me to the game's story starts out with a potentially interesting premise. We live in a world where magic is feared by the majority of humans. A millennium ago, there was a war between humans who normally can't perform magic and espers who can. This war, known as the War of the Magi, resulted in espers fleeing to another dimension, and the world where the game actually takes place being left without magic, but with a whole lot of rhabdophobia. People tend to freak out when they see someone performing magic. When the game begins, there's an evil, corrupt empire seeking to capture espers and steal the power of magic for themselves so they can rule the world. Now, if we judge the premise entirely on its own, independent of anything else that happens in the game, it certainly has the potential for an interesting story. The key word being potential. Nearly any premise has the potential to be interesting. If you are going to judge a game's story sight unseen after only seeing its premise, I consider that to be rather close-minded. But when judging the story overall, how well the premise is executed is extremely important, and the execution behind this game's story is just abysmal. Once we learn Terra's backstory, that's when things start going off the rails. Terra is a character who starts the game with amnesia. For the record, this is the third game in the series, aka half of the game so far, where either a main character or a major supporting character has amnesia as a plot device. Anyway, the only things Terra remembers are her own name and her ability to use magic unaided. Eventually, she turns into a white creature with Raditz' hairstyle and flies off. She eventually wakes up and remembers her own backstory, and this is where the game goes right in the shitter and never recovers. It turns out that Terra is half human and half esper. A human accidentally stumbled into the land of the espers by entering a cave. Seriously, how has nobody found the land of espers in 1,000 goddamn years if stumbling upon it, even by accident, was as simple as going through a fucking cave? Even by accident, the land of espers should be intruded upon by mortals all the fucking time. Oh, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Terra's father was an esper named Maudwin, and her mother was a human named Madonna, not that one. Madonna was told that humans aren't welcome in the land of espers because humans suck, and so she prepares to leave. However, Maudwin apparently has a boner for Madonna, so he stops her and quote-unquote convinces her to stay. He does this by flying over her head and peeing on her, which apparently brainwashes her into thinking that she can stay. Also, it turns out that Maudwin's piss not only has the power to roofie human women, but also can make babies pop out of thin air without the woman even having to get pregnant. Later, the Empire discovered and invaded the land of espers, this time on purpose, and kidnapped Terra, recognizing her as the half-breed she actually is, and raising her as a slave to the Empire, leading us to the opening cutscene we see at the start of the game. Wow. Just wow. Bear in mind that it's only because of Terra being kidnapped that the Empire was able to start the war that serves as the A-plot for this game. So without Terra being born, there would be no Final Fantasy VI, and Terra was literally born thanks to magic roofie piss! Now, I know what some of you are already saying. This wasn't magic roofie piss, they were actually falling in love. You are such a pervert! Get your hand out of the gutter! Well, I'm not the one saying this is magic roofie piss, the game is! Let's break this down, shall we? First of all, Maudwin and Madonna are not falling in love. The two have literally just met. Maudwin noticed Madonna lying unconscious and barely alive on the ground, and so he took her to get medical care. That's not love right there, that's just bog standard compassion for another person. Since when has romantic love been a prerequisite to just being a good Samaritan? So no, Maudwin has not fallen in love with Madonna. He doesn't know anything at all about Madonna except how hot she is. He isn't in love, he just has a boner. There's a big difference. Madonna, likewise, has no reason to fall in love with Maudwin. She has literally just met him less than an hour ago in universe, and literally the only conversation she has had with him so far consisted of little more than Maudwin and his friends telling her how much humans suck. She has absolutely no reason to stay in this land where she is explicitly told she isn't welcome, simply because one of the guys who told her she isn't welcome stopped her at the exit and peed in her face. No, she was roofied, plain and simple. Maudwin's piss brainwashed Madonna into accepting her role as Maudwin's bride and sex slave. Then there's the piss. Okay, these graphics aren't the best, so maybe these little sparkles aren't actually supposed to be his piss, but just something magical. However, look at where the sparkles are coming out. They're clearly coming from his pelvis area. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I take a piss, it usually comes out of my dick. And I don't know about the rest of you, but my dick is typically located in the pelvis region of my body. Then again, maybe I'm just weird that way. Maybe my body is just deformed like that, and most other people piss out their ears. Then there's the fact that baby Terra just pops into existence out of literal nothingness. Some may argue that just because Terra appears in the game out of thin air doesn't mean that's how she was conceived in universe. However, this same flashback also shows us a time skip of 2 years in order to set up the aforementioned Imperial invasion. So clearly, Katase knows how to do time skips. If he wanted to make a 9-month time skip in this flashback to show that Madonna was impregnated and then gave birth naturally, he very easily could have done so. Later in the game, there's another woman who is established as being pregnant. Then we go off and do other stuff in the game, which counts as time passing. And then in the game's epilogue, the game actually goes out of its way to depict that woman actually giving birth. This was actually a background character who isn't even playable, so the game honestly would have an excuse for glossing over her pregnancy, and yet Terra's birth, which is responsible for setting the events of this game into motion, has baby Terra just popping on screen out of thin air. No, Terra magically popping into existence is clearly something that is meant to happen in-universe. Last but not least, there's the naming. After Terra pops into existence out of thin air, Maduin states, "We have decided to name her Terra," and then Madonna is clearly confused by this new development. First of all, Madonna's line clearly shows that she is just as taken aback by this sudden turn of events as I am. Meanwhile, why does Maduin need to say this to Madonna? If Madonna is Terra's mother, shouldn't she already know what Terra's name is? Or when Maduin says "we," he means the other Espers and never asked for Madonna's input on what to name the girl. Clearly, Madonna did not participate in choosing a name for the baby she herself apparently gave birth to. So no matter how you slice it, there is no way I can interpret this cutscene as anything other than magic roofie piss. Maduin and Madonna were not falling in love. Rather, Maduin had the hots for Madonna, used his magic roofie piss to make a baby appear out of thin air, and then brainwashed Madonna into sticking around as Maduin's sex slave and baby mama, and Katase somehow thought this was supposed to be endearing. Okay, deep breaths. Let's take a step back and give Katase every conceivable benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that, while this cutscene's execution might indeed be absolute shit, that Katase's intention behind this cutscene was that Maduin and Madonna were actually falling in love for realsies, and then conceiving a child together using the normal procedure. Then, let's ignore the absolutely abysmal execution of the cutscene and instead judge this cutscene solely on intent. How does the rest of the game's story hold up? Honestly, very fucking poorly! That whole cutscene I just described, that is given to us in a flashback after Terra regains her memories. It's Terra giving us this backstory from her own memory of stuff that happened before she was born and when she was still a baby. How? Then there are all the other main characters. Katase stated in an interview that his primary goal with Final Fantasy VI was to create a game where everyone was the main character. He wanted players to be able to simply pick a character that most appeals to them and use them as the POV character. However, in order to do that, the game needs to have plenty of playable characters in order to appeal to a wide variety of gamers. The first half of the game has a total of 10 playable characters to choose from. While that certainly gives us a lot of characters to choose from as our audience insert, it comes at a terrible price. While most of these characters have personalities, fairly one-dimensional personalities, but personalities nonetheless, very few of them receive any character development. Edgar, Sabin, Shadow, Gao, Strago, Realm, and Setzer all have next to no character development. They have personalities, but they end the game with the exact same personalities they were introduced with. I honestly wouldn't mind if the few character arcs the game did explore were actually very interesting. Unfortunately, they are not. Take, for example, Sion, a man who is in grief because the woman he loved has died. This has killed his will to continue living until his beloved comes back temporarily, just long enough to tell him to grow a damn pair and stop being such a pussy. This pep talk from his beloved gives him the strength to keep going. That was Sion, not to be confused with Locke, a man who is in grief because the woman he loved has died. This has killed his will to continue living until his beloved comes back temporarily, just long enough to tell him to grow a damn pair and stop being such a pussy. This pep talk from his beloved gives him the strength to keep going. Now, I don't have a problem with the central theme of learning to accept the inevitability of death and move on with life. Unlike the magic roofie piss, that is a perfectly valid central theme to explore. But did we really need to have two different characters undergo the exact same character arc almost verbatim? It honestly just seems repetitive, considering that only 4 of the main characters actually get anything you could even call character development. The fact that 2 of those 4 characters get the exact same character development just shows a lack of imagination on Katase's part. Terra has a character arc that is primarily in the second half of the game, and I really dislike it. When we catch up with her, we find that she is taken to caring for some orphaned children in the city of Mobliz, whose parents have all been murdered by Kefka. She refuses to rejoin the Returners because she has lost her will to fight, and this is shown to us when she tries to fend off a monster but consistently does 0 damage to it with her attacks. Sometime later, that same monster comes back, and now all of a sudden, she is overcome with the will to fight to protect the orphans. Upon defeating the monster, she realizes she must fight in order to protect those she loves, in this case the orphans. Now, it's bad enough that her losing her will to fight is something that just fixes itself. It would be a lot more satisfying if the other Returners used their cunning to solve problems, rather than the plot arbitrarily deciding when those obstacles should be overcome. But even barring that, it just makes no sense that she suddenly gets her will to fight back because of the return of the very same monster that she previously tried to fend off but couldn't do any damage to because she had no will to fight. If she gets back her will to fight against the monster the second time, why didn't it work the first time? You know the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Couldn't you just change up the monster's attacks just a touch? Honestly, it just comes off as a pure plot convenience that Terra somehow gets back her will to fight the second time the monster attacks. So that just leaves Celise, or rather the romance that develops between Celise and Locke. Unlike Maudwin and Madonna, we actually see their relationship flourish. Celise doesn't initially trust Locke, but Locke proves time and time again that he's going to protect her. It gets to the point where Celise actually feels betrayed that Locke isn't around to watch over her. As far as romance is concerned, it's a fairly bog-standard development of the relationship. However, considering that the only other romance in this game is based around magic roofie piss, even the by-the-numbers romance is like a breath of fresh air. So that does it for the character arcs, what few character arcs there are. Let's talk about the plot. As it turns out, the Espers are ultimately just a means to an end for Kefka, the main villain of this game. As it turns out, Kefka just wants to destroy the world, and he accomplishes this by moving the 3 statues of the goddesses around and causing them to be in a new position relative to each other. Apparently, these statues need to be in this equilateral triangle position, and if one or more of them are ever moved out of that triangle position, the world will collapse in on itself. Well, allow me to get out my reading glasses, because the library is open. This is stupid. It's not as stupid as the magic roofie piss, but it's up there. Final Fantasy V honestly had the perfect way of handling the end of the world. When the elemental crystals burst, their respective elements slowly die out, causing the Earth to become uninhabitable. What's the difference maker here? The people of the world were using the crystals as perpetual energy generators to improve their way of life, putting those crystals under intense strain. In a way, the people of the world had destroyed their own planet, and that is what makes Final Fantasy V's Doomsday Prophecy so brilliant. This provided a nice, interesting analog to the way we, in the real world, are slowly but surely tearing our planet apart in pursuit of more and more natural resources in order to maintain our gluttonous way of life. But here? Oh, a little bit of interior redecorating. Yeah, you can sink entire continents just by moving a couch. This is just lame. Oh, but if you think the way the world ends in this game is lame, just wait until you see what the world is like after it ends. This takes us to... At first, the end of the world, especially when viewed from orbit, looks pretty terrifying. We see tectonic plates shifting right before our very eyes, which we assume must cause earthquakes and volcanic eruptions on a scale never before seen. I mean, tectonic plates in the real world can cause massive earthquakes just by moving at a rate of about 1 inch a year. If the plates are moving so fast you can literally watch it happen in real time, what's gonna happen to the actual land? We wake up as Celise, with Cid watching over us, and we're told that it's been 1 whole year since the world ended. We are also told that, as far as he knows, you and he are the only 2 survivors of humanity. Cid has come down with an illness, and if he dies, Celise will actually try to kill herself. This section of the game is so well written that it almost makes me forget that this was all set into motion in the first place because of magic roofie piss. However, while this scene provides a brief respite to the stupidity that is the rest of the plot, gameplay-wise it is tedious, boring, and repetitive. As I mentioned, Cid has come down with an illness. This means he hasn't eaten in 3 days, so he's obviously quite hungry. So you go to the nearby beach and catch some fish for him to eat. You can only catch 1 fish at a time, and you have to catch the fastest fish in order for Cid to make a full recovery. Oh, but you can't just give him 1 fish and he'll recover. You have to give him multiple fish. Eventually, I just got bored of this busy work and gave Cid the slowest fish on purpose because that would kill him instantly, just so I could continue with the game. Now, Kitase is said to have been the director for the game's story, while Ito is said to have been the director for the game's battle sequences. This is neither. This is gameplay that isn't related to battle, so I don't know whether it was Kitase or Ito who ultimately had final say on this minigame. But whoever had final say in the matter fucked up big time. Who the hell in their right mind would honestly think that this monotonous drudge work was a fun distraction from the main game? Well, regardless of whether Cid lives or dies, we then get a raft that we can use to reach the mainland. And that's when the brief pocket of good storytelling ends and the game's plot goes right back to being shit. The second half of this game is predominantly focused on reuniting the returners so we can launch an attack on Kefka's tower. Once we get the second airship, we can do the final dungeon, but since we have to divide ourselves into 3 groups anyway, it's probably a good idea to build up a sizable army. Now, just like the premise at the start of the game, this has the potential to be an interesting premise for the second half of the game. We could see how the apocalypse has affected the lives of the people, maybe even go on a few side quests in order to re-recruit the ex-returners, helping them solve their problems and therefore providing character development. However, the game completely and utterly fails to take advantage of this premise. With the exception of Terra, Edgar, and Realm, two of which I've already discussed, whenever we meet a former returner, recruiting them again requires little more than just walking up to them and talking to them. Sion is found at the end of a dungeon, sure, but after completing that dungeon, Sion rejoins the group merely by having us talk to him. Worse still, these people rarely can be found actually doing anything to survive in the apocalypse. Sabin has spent the past year standing around the city of Tizen and doing fuck all. Setzer has been sitting around in the pub at Collingen and doing fuck all. Gao is hanging out in the wilderness doing what he always does. Strago has spent the past year, dancing in a conga line. What? Meanwhile, Realm can be seen offering her painting skills for hire, which doesn't sound even remotely like something that would be a priority after the world ends. Okay, I have about 1,000 problems with the second half of this game, but the majority of them can be broken down into 3 main gripes. First, this doesn't feel like the end of the world. With the exception of Mobliz, nearly every city in the game seems to be doing business as usual. Except for the orphaned kids in Mobliz, everyone else seems at worst to be mildly irritated by the end of the world, if not completely unfazed. This honestly doesn't feel like the end of the world so much as a rearranging of the world. Sadly, the lame consequences of the apocalypse seem to fit with the lame actions Kefka took to cause this to happen in the first place. I honestly can't tell if this makes the apocalypse doubly lame, or if the lameness of one thing covers up for the lameness of the other. Kind of like that episode of the Newlywed Game where one woman said her mother-in-law was 10 decades old, only for her husband to make the same mistake, also say 10 decades, and so they got the points regardless. Is this the Final Fantasy equivalent of that? Does the lame apocalypse cause cancel out with the lame apocalypse effect? Or do the two combine to create double lameness? I'll let you guys decide down in the comments. Second, as I've said before, many of the former returners need only to be spoken to in order to get them to join back up. This begs the question, if it was that easy, why haven't the returners already reformed? It has been an entire year since Kefka did his interior redecorating of doom! And yet, each of the former returners are just hanging out, not doing a damn thing. Was the conga line really that much fun, Strago, that you spent an entire year dancing in it instead of doing anything else at all, like finding a way to defeat Kefka or, oh, I don't know, searching for your damn granddaughter? You had an entire year to find your granddaughter, and you choose to spend it dancing in a goddamn conga line. This place is called Fanatics Tower, not Lunatics Tower! Terra is literally the only character with an excuse here. In addition to quote-unquote losing her will to fate, which I've already expressed my distaste for, she at least was looking after some orphaned kids. At least she was doing something that was even the least bit productive. I might find her whole losing will to fight shtick to be contrived out the ass, but I can at least understand why she would be just a little bit hesitant to drop her newfound responsibilities on a dime just to run off and get herself killed. When Celeste woke up from her coma and then sailed to the mainland, She should have set out to rejoin the returners who have been keeping up the resistance for the past year, not reuniting the returners after a year of them being inactive. However, I wouldn't even mind the returners still being scattered after a year's time if the game actually did something with that concept. This leads me to my third main gripe about the second half of the game. For an apocalypse setting, there's no real lack of life. You would expect an apocalyptic setting to be virtually devoid of life, but the characters seem just as lively as they were in the first half. The overworld may look brown and gray, but as I mentioned earlier in this video, the muted colors and music in the first overworld also bummed me out. No, if there's one area where this apocalyptic setting seems to be devoid of life, it's the way Katase has completely and utterly failed to breathe life into the story. I wouldn't even mind all the various returners being scattered across the world if each of them had subplots that needed to be resolved before they would be willing to rejoin the fight. We could have some episodic storytelling, as each subplot could be self-contained. We could get some character development for most of these characters, and they could also be portrayed as heroes as they help out the common folk as they struggle every day for survival in a post-apocalyptic world where humans are no longer at the top of the food chain. But nope, Terra and Edgar are the only characters who need to have their subplots closed before they rejoin the returners. You could make an argument for Locke also needing his subplot closed, but that's mostly a semantics argument. When you meet up with Locke, he effectively rejoins at that point. It's just that there's a long, unskippable cutscene immediately thereafter where his subplot is closed. Were it not for that cutscene, Locke would rejoin as soon as you meet up with him. You can close Sion's subplot after he rejoins, but that's only because Sion is literally the only other character in this game besides Terra, Locke, and Celeste who even has a subplot in the first place, which, as I pointed out earlier, is a problem with this game overall, not just the second half of this game. So, when I finally decide to put myself out of my misery and just get this game over with, I head over to Kefka Tower. Before we enter, there's a brief discussion about what will happen when we destroy the goddess statues. This means that all the magic in the world— wait a minute. We have to destroy the statues all of a sudden? When was that ever discussed? I thought all we had to do was kill Kefka. Why do we need to destroy the statues? From a gameplay perspective, we need to destroy the statues because they're blocking our path through the dungeon. But from a story perspective, why do the returners need to destroy the statues in order to restore peace to the world? It honestly seems like the only reason we get this brought up is to point out that when this happens, all magic in the world will cease to exist. For those who have absorbed espers, this means they'll lose their magical powers. But for Terra, who is naturally magical, it is unclear how she will be affected. Despite knowing the risk, Terra is prepared to do whatever it takes to stop Kefka. So this is at least one decent character moment from Terra. Lord knows this game needs all the character moments it can get. However, when we actually destroy the third statue, nothing seems to happen. It is revealed that Kefka drained their power and took it for himself, causing himself to become the source of all magic in the world. Because he can apparently do that. Well, you know what? I don't have to worry about that anymore because we're finally at the end. We make it up to the top of the tower and meet up with Kefka. He has shown that he has become so drunk with power that he has decided he's just going to kill everyone and destroy all of existence. I can't really tell if this is because he's drunk with power or if this is just the natural extension of Kefka's character. I mean, in the first half of the game, he can be seen poisoning a river, not as a war tactic, but just because he wants to hear the people scream. When he attacks Narshe later in the game, he demands that the residents of Narshe also be killed even though Narshe is a neutral city. He just wants to see them die for its own sake. So when he has the power to cause that kind of destruction single-handedly, of course he's going to go off the deep end and decide he just wants to kill everyone for its own sake. It's clearly not the power that's causing him to do this. Put simply, Kefka is a terrible villain. There is no depth to him. He's evil for the sake of being evil. He just wants power for its own sake. He just wants to cause death and destruction for its own sake. And unlike X-Death in Final Fantasy V, he isn't even hoisted by his own petard, nor does he have a badass villain theme. This game's story from top to bottom is just an abject failure across the board. Kitase had some pretty big shoes to fill as his first outing as director of a Final Fantasy game. Not only was he replacing series founder Hironobu Sakaguchi, but he was coming fresh off the heels of Final Fantasy V, which I have ranked at the top of the list so far. 5 had a cohesive plot, some interesting central themes with environmentalist messages, lovable characters who underwent change and growth, and a main villain with one of the most badass villain theme songs I have ever heard. In exchange for all of that, this game gives us magic roofie piss. Need I say more? For all of these reasons and more, I rank Final Fantasy VI in between Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy IV. 3's story is just as broken, disjointed, and incoherent as this game's is, for reasons I've already stated in that game's retrospective video. But this game has at least a few gameplay innovations, such as puzzles in a few of the dungeons and the ability to switch between groups of parties, and a few interesting mini-games, to bring it above Final Fantasy III in the gameplay department. Next time, I'll do a retrospective analysis of the first game to be released in 3D, the first game to be released on the PlayStation, and the most popular and commercially successful game in the entire franchise, Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation 1. I wonder if there's going to be any impalements in that game. But nah, they'd never do that for a kid's game. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this retrospective, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like it. Also, if you enjoyed my content overall, please consider supporting the channel directly, either with Patreon support or channel memberships. Silver and Gold level members and Patreon supporters are allowed to submit requests for video topics, and Gold members and Patreon supporters are allowed to directly assign me video topics that I am guaranteed to cover. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace!